Hey, this is Jacob Evan. Thanks for tuning in. In this video, we'll be considering the testing of prophets, the recognition of the need to assess later books and whether they are in line with the Torah, in line with the biblical law, and alongside that, some of the stories in the Tanakh or the Hebrew Bible about King David. Over the course of my first year of recognizing the importance of the Torah, the importance of the law, recognizing that it is intended to be followed even today, I had some questions about what is considered scripture. One of the early groups that I attended was very insistent that Paul was supposedly teaching the Torah. So much so that we ended up debating whether Paul taught against the Torah more than actually studying the Torah, the very thing that was supposed to be important. Because of those very issues, it became clear to me that we needed to assess whether prophets were truly in line with the Torah. I realized that I couldn't just trust the Calvinist Church of the 1600s to tell me which books were scripture, which books were not scripture, because clearly they did not use the Torah as their standard for truth. I had known from my time in Christianity that there were other Bible canons, other collections of books, which included the Apocrypha or Deuterocanon. I also knew there were books which claimed to be written by apostles or other biblical figures, and some of them were rejected by almost everyone as being false and from some other source, and then some of them were thought to be maybe credible or may have been referenced in some of the other books. And whenever I started studying more after becoming aware of the Torah, I started learning that there were early Messianic groups that also recognized the Torah and had their own collection of books, including one group that rejected Paul and only accepted one gospel. So this skepticism was apparently there with certain groups from around the beginning, at least the beginning of the Messianic movements. I remember a time whenever some of my friends and I were looking over various books and trying to see if they were pro-Torah. The tricky thing was we didn't know the Torah that well. We had probably been in this less than 6 months, and a lot of that time had been divided into studying other books and trying to reconcile a new view from the New Testament and other books. So our knowledge of the Torah was mainly from the immediately practical sense, and it was surface level at best. We certainly had not built up a knowledge of what the Torah said from a Torah-based lens, even though we probably thought that we had at that time. So ironically, I think the way I went about trying to test these books or assess them is by looking for more general statements about the Torah. Did it say you should follow the Torah, or did it say to not break the Torah? Did it say generally that the Torah was good? I say that was ironic because I had already realized that a false prophet can say the Torah is good and then go and teach something false, even something false about the Torah. But for whatever reason, that awareness which I had for the one context had not fully generalized yet now. Now I realize a better approach might have been to put that question on hold about these later books. Of course, I was trying to sort out all of my theological beliefs as quickly as possible. I was motivated to try to understand this big picture, so that might have been easier said than done. But I recognize now how there is this need to basically isolate ourselves from other influences as we are learning the Torah, if we really want to see what the Torah says for itself, if we want to see the Torah from a Torah-based lens. This is something I've observed since then, and this is something which other people I know have indicated as well. And if you're like us, you arrive at a very different view of things when you do not allow yourself to jump to some other book to tell you about the Torah. You are developing a different view of things when you study the Torah for itself and focus on learning what it says, rather than what it supposedly means by the standard of some other source. With that in mind, I wanted to discuss some of the stories described in the Tanakh about King David, and some questions that might arise regarding the application of the Torah. We could just look at passages like some of the Psalms, which are supposed to be from David, or some of the quotes or statements in some of these later books, and try to come to a conclusion from that. But I think it is worth considering actions as well. David may not have been a prophet in the same way as some of the figures who have prophetic books attributed to them, but we still want to have a more Torah-based perspective on these things regardless. We are going to consider the Bathsheba incident, the Bathsheba incident, David fleeing out of his house from Saul, and the subsequent Showbread incident, or the bread of the presence incident, and the priesthood of David. So let's start with the Bathsheba incident. 1 Kings 15:5 basically says that this is the only thing which David ever did wrong in his life, although I will invite us to continue to wonder about this statement. The incident with Bathsheba and her husband Uriah is condemned within the account itself, and I think most people accept this was an unacceptable error on David's part. But let's consider the story and a few things which are mentioned within it. The incident is described in 2 Samuel 11 and 12. It starts off by David seeing this beautiful woman one evening bathing on a rooftop. According to verse 3, he knew she was married, but apparently he didn't care because he sent his agents to bring her to him, and then he had his way with her. She then became pregnant, and David ultimately decided to fix the problem by having her husband Uriah killed. He ordered the leader of the army to effectively set Uriah up and put him on the front line of battle, and then have everyone else withdraw and abandon him so that he would be even more susceptible to the enemy, the soldiers of the enemy nation, that is, and he would then be killed. And David got what he wanted out of his plan. The Ammonites killed Uriah, and David got Bathsheba as his wife out of the ordeal. Now, the story goes on to say that Nathan was sent by God because David had done evil in his eyes, and he goes on to declare that to him. And there are some interesting things which are stated. It says that he despised the word of Elohim, using the name, and it says that he did evil in his sight. It says that David took Uriah's wife, and it says that David killed Uriah with the sword of the Ammonites. And then there is this curse laid upon not only David, but upon his house, unto Holam, a Hebrew word which is sometimes translated as forever, the same word which appears in the context of the commandments being forever. It says, a sword shall not turn aside from his house unto Holam, because David despised God and took Uriah's woman. Then it says that God is going to raise evil over his house and cause comparable things to happen to him before the eyes of the people rather than in private. But seemingly, in a turn of what was just said, it says the sin has effectively been pardoned, except for the fact that David essentially dishonored God before the enemy, therefore his illegitimate son will die. So we should acknowledge that it does clearly condemn what he did. It does not paint him as being in the right on that. But I have a few questions as far as certain Torah commands are concerned, and as far as the curse is concerned. One thing that I had to look into on this was the description of the man who was killed, Uriah. Most of the time when he is mentioned by name, he is described as Uriah ha-Hittite, Uriah the Hittite. And I looked into this, and it seems to be the most likely interpretation, the plain interpretation in the Torah. That's the very same word that you see in, for example, Deuteronomy 7:1. It is one of the condemned nations referred to in the commands. In Deuteronomy 7:2, it says, you shall smite them, and you shall surely devote them to destruction, and you shall not cut a covenant with them, and you shall not favor them. So I have to wonder, what was going on here with the Bathsheba incident, or even before it? Because if Uriah was indeed a Hittite, as it apparently says, then smiting him shouldn't have been a problem. In fact, it would appear to have been following Deuteronomy 7:2 from what I can tell. Of course, going off of what it says in Deuteronomy 31:29, Moses says the people are going to turn away after his death, and even from the book of Joshua, they're cutting deals with some of the Canaanites, and they're allowing some of them to stay in the land. So this probably shouldn't be any kind of surprise that there were still Canaanites around, and they were integrating into the society. But it is strange considering that prophecy. It is strange that this Hittite aspect of it does not seem to be acknowledged in a way that is consistent with the Torah. The other thing I found conspicuous about this story is the curse that was laid upon his house. Someone might point out how his sin was essentially forgiven, but if that were the entirety of it, then I'm not sure what the purpose of laying out that curse was and referring to it as olam. I would think having the house cursed, especially as a king, would be a big problem as far as the continuation of that line would be concerned. This part is certainly a bit more subjective, since the curse doesn't say that he will never have a man on the throne again like a certain other person in the Tanakh, but it might be something to wonder about. And it might be worth noting that David continued to keep Bathsheba as his wife, and Solomon was supposed to be their son. The next incident is the showbread incident, or the bread of the presence incident. I talked about this in one of my recent videos and also in a video about the Hebrew Matthew. This story is fairly well known also, probably largely due to the fact that it is mentioned in some of the Gospels as a teaching point or as a point of argument. This takes place in 1 Samuel 21, but it may be important to recognize some of the events leading up to it. So David was in this feud with King Saul, and King Saul kept trying to kill him or have him killed. One of these attempts is described in 1 Samuel 19:11-18. David is at his home, and the agents of King Saul had staked out his residence and were going to kill him. But David found out, and his wife helped him to escape. And here's what it says that his wife did in order to cover up his escape. In verse 13 it says, David's wife took the Teraphim, put the Teraphim on the bed or couch, and set up the scene to look like he was sleeping, to look like David was still there and he was just sleeping. And then in verse 16 the agents of Saul enter in and discover it's not David, but instead Teraphim. So the question might be, what is or what are the Teraphim? It's not a word which appears in the commands of the Torah, but it does appear some other times in the Tanakh, including in the narrative of Genesis. In Genesis 31, it says that Rachel or Rachel stole the Teraphim from her father. And then her father goes on to accuse them of having stolen his Elohim, stolen his gods. She stole the Teraphim, she stole his gods. The connection in that passage is clear. And based on other examples in the Hebrew texts, the Teraphim appear to have been used for the purpose of divination and foretelling the future in an illegitimate way. It says that King Josiah or King Yoshiyahu removed these from the land along with other forbidden things, and that was supposedly because of the command in the Torah, according to 2 Kings 23:24. So going back to this David incident, are we going to wonder about why he apparently had Teraphim idols in his house? Why his wife was able to take Teraphim and either they had a life-size, a human-size idol that she was able to put on the couch to trick the people into thinking it was David, or maybe they just had so many idols that they could just lay them out in a way that was big enough to look like a human form under the covers. Something like that, at least. That doesn't seem to match with this claim that David had done no wrong. And going back to the showbread incident, of course this was precipitated by repeated attempts of fleeing from Saul, repeated attempts where Saul was trying to kill him. And this time in 1 Samuel 21 it says he came to the priest. And it says this took place in the city of Nov, which I found to be interesting. And the priest was afraid of David and asked him why he was there. David tells them that he is there because the king commanded him on some secret business. In other words, he's not being forthright with the priest, what might be considered lying. And then David demands that the priest give him food. The priest says he has nothing other than the holy bread, later specified as the bread of the presence, the showbread. Even though it is holy bread, the priest compromises and tells David that if the men have been kept from women, he will give them the bread. And David assures him it is okay, so he gets the bread from the priest. The first point of interest is probably a minor one in the scope of this discussion, but I found it interesting that this took place at Nov, a location that had not been mentioned prior to my awareness. And if they were following much of a semblance of the Torah at that point, that means the tent of meeting, the sanctuary or holy structure of the Torah, must have been at that location, or at least a replica of it. The bread was set on the table in the tent of meeting according to Exodus 25:30, and according to Leviticus 24:8-9, it is holy of holies. It is Kodesh Kodashim, and it is connected with an everlasting covenant, a covenant of Olam, and it is commanded to be eaten by Aaron and his sons in a holy place. And when it says holy place, this is connected with the courtyard of the tent of meeting in Leviticus 6:9 or 6:16. So if the priest were otherwise doing the commands, otherwise except whenever he was being pressured by David to break them and to rationalize how it was somehow okay to break them, then the incident would have taken place at the tent of meeting. This is actually what is also understood in Matthew 12, verse 4, as well, whenever the story is retold there, because it says that David, quote, entered into the house of God, and he ate the bread of the presence, which he was not allowed to be eating, neither the ones with him, but for the priests only. Now, the story in Samuel doesn't explicitly say that, but I can understand how that would be assumed. And a question I would have about this incident is, why was it so important for David to get the bread of the presence? To eat the bread, which is described as one of the holiest of the fire offerings of Elohim, as an everlasting ritual command in Leviticus 24:9. I get the fact that he was in a hurry and trying to avoid being killed by Saul's agents, but why was it so important to get the food from the tent of meeting or wherever he was stopping? And why was he stopping there of all places to get food? I assume part of the reason was that he wanted to get the sword from the priest, but if he truly were worried about following all of the commands, as some of the narrative would convey, then I would think he would be inclined to set that as off limits. I would think they would have had grain and animals on hand otherwise, just because they needed to do the offerings on a regular basis, and so they needed the supply, but perhaps that would have taken too much time to prepare for him. I would think he could have gone and lied to someone else other than the priest, but maybe he thought the priest would be too scared to spill the beans that he had seen him, and he thought it would be safer because the priest would probably keep his presence a secret. And David does not cite that his life was in danger or anything of that sort in order to justify eating the forbidden bread, although in his mind maybe that was part of it. I know there is an idea in Orthodox Judaism and some other interpretations that you can supposedly break almost any law in the case of a threat to life, but I do not see that spoken clearly in the commands. And David does not cite that either way, nor does the Matthew 12 retelling of it. And this incident reminds me of a command which is probably not considered very thoroughly in most cases today. And that is a reoccurring command which appears, for example, in Leviticus 19:30. Which says, "You shall fear my sanctuary." Since the Torah sanctuary is something which does not currently exist, or at least it is not known, is not in known use if it does, I would suspect that most people don't dwell on this command or what it would mean to observe it. In my previous video on the ceremonial laws, I described how there is this level of seriousness associated with the rituals of the Torah, including the rituals of the tent of meeting. And many of them are associated with the death penalty, or with being cut off from the people. Even the special anointing oil recipe and the incense recipe used at the tent of meeting is reserved for it alone, under penalty of being cut off from the people. So if he is truly going to the priest, if David is truly going to the tent of meeting, and he's scaring the priest and lying to him, and then eating the offering, which was not allowed in the Torah to be done, then would that be following the command of fearing the sanctuary? Does that show any level of fear for my sanctuary, as described in Leviticus 19:30? The final story I wanted to refer to is regarding the priesthood of David, and this is primarily based upon one single verse, but I'm going to connect it to another story within the narrative. So this verse is usually translated in a way to obscure what the Hebrew says for some reason. Indeed, there is another verse which seems to be a retelling of this one in Chronicles, and it is worded differently in the Hebrew and makes it sound more innocent. But all we can do is acknowledge what it says here. In 2 Samuel 8:18 it says, "And sons of David were priests." It says David's sons were Kohanim. It says they were priests. And I tried looking into whether there was any other way to translate Kohanim, any other meaning behind that could be established, and I found nothing that seemed legitimate. This is the word which is used regarding the priests of Aaron, the commanded priests of the Torah commands. So if we take this verse's word for things, then apparently David must have set up his sons within the priesthood. And this reminds me of an earlier incident a few chapters before this. In 2 Samuel 6:14, it talks about how David was dressed in a linen ephod whenever he was dancing before the ark, while the high priest in the Torah had an ephod, and it was made of linen and some other textiles and some other materials. It looks like by the time of Samuel the son of Korah, there was a practice of wearing linen ephods as priests. And we see that alluded to in 1 Samuel 22:18, among other places. And if you continue in that 2 Samuel 6 passage, it says they placed the ark in a tent which David set up for it. And David goes on to offer offerings at it. And then David goes on to bless the people using the name. So it certainly seems like he had taken it upon himself to act as a priestly figure. So would it be any wonder if some of his sons were appointed to that role as well, if he appointed some of his own sons to act as priests? And that would not have been allowed by the standard of the Torah, because the chosen priesthood, according to the commands, is the priesthood of Aaron, and other people are not allowed to approach in that capacity. Maybe for David, if this was something he had set his eyes upon, like with Bathsheba, maybe the goal was the most important thing. And the fact that it portrays him as worshiping the correct Elohim is not the only thing that matters, because if you look back to the incidents described in the narrative of the Torah, we see the sons of Aaron, 2 of the sons of Aaron were killed for offering the wrong offering. And we see that the congregation of Korah and those associated with him were destroyed for doing something similar. So there are other things to consider beyond just whether a person is doing it supposedly on behalf of the correct God. And if we think about what went on after David, we might also consider how this could be connected with Solomon and the total downfall of Israel, assuming it had not already been complete in the time of Judges. It is my belief that the way children learn, for the most part, is through imitation. The way a child learns is by modeling the parent. They learn from what the parent does and how the parent acts. They even learn how to think just by observing their parents. Of course, in some cases, a child can change as they grow older. They can step outside of some of these things they learned and then choose to think differently and do differently. But as a general rule, a lot of these behaviors and ways of thinking and ways of prioritizing things continue throughout the child's entire life. And I imagine this could be part of the reason why these cycles and repetitions occur from generation to generation within families, regardless of whatever is supposedly said or taught by the parents' words. And certainly we don't know the details of what went on in Solomon's childhood or how much he even interacted with his father David, but it seems conspicuous that he appears to be repeating some of these same problems. He had a problem with keeping the commands when women were a priority to him, and that might even be seen as overlapping with not fearing the sanctuary, because he sought to build other sanctuaries in ways which were not according to the Torah, including, but not limited to, temples for other Elohim. There are certainly other questionable things that went on, but my point in this is to not just list the misdeeds of others. The purpose is that we consider these stories with care, and we consider them in the light of the Torah. There are many incidents in the non-Torah parts of the Tanakh, as well as in other later books, that tell about people breaking the law and say nothing of it being a problem. While the Bathsheba incident was condemned, at least in part, there are many things which either are not clarified according to a Torah standard, or they pass under the radar as not being a problem because the people had gotten so far away from the Torah, just as Moses foretold, even early on, even before it explicitly lays that out. If we just look in these books for some kind of statement about the Torah being good, or if we just listen to these later prophets so far as they say something about needing to follow the Torah, then we might very likely miss out on other important details. That may cause us to lower our guard in a way that we let ourselves be taught something other than the Torah, as if it were the Torah. These later books and later prophets and what goes on in them or what is said by them can shape how we view the Torah if we are under the belief that they all must agree with it. And this is why we need to go to the source. This is why we need a firm foundation in the source. We need to seek Elohim, and we need to seek his ways and his truth, and we need an understanding of his Torah, which is built upon his Torah.